Hello, my name is Trey Marchbanks with Texas A&M University, and today we're going to talk a little bit about the school-to-prison pipeline and moving beyond simply encountering the justice system, but following through each of the subsequent stages of processing. So, referral to a prosecutor, the prosecutor's decision to pursue the charges, and then finally the ultimate disposition that we will see. The research that we present here was supported by the Comprehensive School Safety Initiative of the National Institute of Justice. We're grateful for the funding. Of course, any conclusions or recommendations here are those of myself and the co-authors, and don't necessarily reflect those of the Department of Justice. As I mentioned, I have two wonderful co-authors and also co-principal investigators on the project. Jamelia Blake, also at Texas A&M University, and then Anthony Peguero at Arizona State University. So we're going to look at two core research questions. The first one is whether or not the school-to-prison pipeline extends to disposition. There's already a fair amount of research done to establish that there is this school-to-prison pipeline where those who are involved in school discipline are ultimately involved in the juvenile justice system. But again, we're looking at all the way to disposition. And we also want to look at whether or not racial disparities continue through each of these subsequent steps of the juvenile justice system. So let's take a minute to look at the data sources that we have. The first is the Public Education Information Management System, better known as PEIMS, from the Texas Education Agency. This particular data set has the individual level information on every public school student in the state of Texas. And so we have measures like the grades that they receive, their performance on standardized tests, grade promotion, but we also have, particularly important for this study, any disciplinary action taken against a student that is in school suspension or higher is placed in this data set as well. We also have from TEA the Academic Excellence Indicator System, or AEIS. This one is publicly available. It basically provides contextual information about a campus and the information about it. So we have student-teacher ratios, the overall socioeconomic level of the campus, things along those lines. We also have the Texas Juvenile Probation Commission, as they were formerly known now as the Texas Juvenile Justice Department. Information on every referral that was made to the juvenile justice system, not only the referral but also the description of the alleged offense and what the ultimate disposition of that was. We were fortunate to be able to have TEA and TJPC to work together on merging these two data sets together, and we were able to find over approximately 90% of all of the records in TJPC had a match within PEIMS, which represents a very high match. So we know with a high level of confidence which students were involved in juvenile justice and which ones were not. Obviously, due to the sensitive nature of the data, they were de-identified before we had access to them, and we also were unavailable to analyze the data unless we were on a secure server that was tunneled into what's referred to as the Education Research Centers, which have been set up by the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board and the Texas Education Agency and the Texas Workforce Commission. Looking at the cohorts, we're looking at the first grade cohorts of 2001 and 2002 school years and following them all the way through to at least 1 year beyond expected graduation. So in all, we have over 600,000 students, and we're able to look at them each year and identify the amount of discipline that they had, the amount of juvenile justice contact that they had, and get a lot of contextual information as well. So I'm going to present a little bit of the results. The first step is predicting which students in our cohort are involved in the school discipline system in a given year. So the results here look at a year, and we're utilizing what's referred to as multivariate analysis. For those of you who are unfamiliar with multivariate analysis, what we're doing is controlling for a variety of factors. In this case, standardized test performance, socioeconomic status, different things like that, removing the effect of those so that we're left with only the effect of the items that we're interested in. So when we look at comparing a white student to an African American student, they are held constant on all the things that we have in our model, and the only thing that differs is their race. And so when we see here that a white student has on average 0.34 disciplinary actions in a given year, while African American students are 79% higher at 0.61, we're able to say that's the unique contribution after controlling for the factors that we control for. Hispanic students were also higher at 0.44, so roughly a third higher than white students. We utilize third generation immigrant as a recognition that outside of Native Americans, we all are immigrants to some degree, and so we're looking at first generation immigrants, which means individuals that were born in another nation. Second generation immigrants, we're utilizing a proxy of whether or not they were born in the U.S., so they're not a first generation immigrant, but they have limited English proficiency at some point in their academic career. We're utilizing that as a proxy for second generation immigrant, which some of the prior literature has done as well. And what we see is compared to third plus generation immigrants, first generation immigrants are actually 7% lower in the level of discipline that they encounter, and second generation immigrants are also lower by about 8%. So here there's a protective nature of where we see immigrant students having less discipline encounters than students in their third plus generation. Now, here we want to look at the ultimate referral into the juvenile justice system. And this is typically where prior research has stopped when we talk about the school to prison pipeline, is the ultimate referral to juvenile justice. Fortunately, the numbers are fairly low, but we do see differences that deserve to be talked about. So white students at 0.012, your African American students are roughly 1/4 higher in the number of juvenile justice referrals they have in a year, and Hispanic students are also 12% higher. When we look at immigrant children, we see that first generation immigrants are actually 41% lower than third plus generation, and second generation is 24% lower. So we're actually seeing that immigrant students are encountering the juvenile justice system less than the more assimilated students. We're also looking at the relationship between school discipline and juvenile justice. And so for individuals that have no discipline, we have approximately 0.012 juvenile justice referrals, where if you have an average amount of discipline, you're going to have 15% more juvenile justice referrals. And for those who have what we refer to as high discipline, which is one standard deviation higher levels of discipline than average, you're almost 100% higher on the amount of juvenile justice referrals that you receive in a given year. So if we look at once a case has been referred to the juvenile justice system, the probation officer faces a decision on whether or not to send that case to a prosecutor. Roughly 43% of cases from white students would be sent to the prosecutor, and both African American and Hispanic students have a roughly, from a statistical perspective, the same relationship. While they differ slightly by 0.01 in each, the relationship from a statistical perspective was non-existent. Looking at immigration, first-generation immigrants have 9% lower likelihood of being referred to a prosecutor, where second-generation immigrants were 4% lower. So again, we're seeing immigrant children less likely to move down the school to prison pipeline. For those who have no discipline, roughly 0.41, if you have an average amount of discipline, you're 5% higher in your likelihood of your case being sent to a prosecutor for review, and a high level of discipline, again, one standard deviation above average, is 12% higher. So once a prosecutor receives this referral, she or he has a decision to make on whether or not to move forward with prosecution. And we see the probability is 0.8 for a white student that their case would be sent to the would be actually prosecuted. And here we're controlling for all of the things we controlled for from the education models, but also including case characteristics, case prior history with the juvenile justice system, and those types of measures. African American students look like white students from a statistical perspective. Hispanic students were slightly higher at 0.82. Immigrant students, we don't see any difference compared to third plus generation students. So their things are pretty similar regardless of immigrant status. Those students who have an average amount of discipline have a 3% higher likelihood of being prosecuted than those who have no discipline, and those who have high discipline are 6% higher in their probability of being prosecuted. Now, once a prosecutor takes a case and decides to prosecute, there's a series of possible outcomes. The most advantageous for the individual would be a finding of not guilty or not true, given that it's a civil case in Texas. But they could also have a dismissal, things like that. Then you could have deferred adjudication, which is like probation, except it can be removed from your record upon completing the probationary period without an issue, formal probation, and then some sort of secure confinement. For the purposes of this report, we're using anything above a not true finding, so deferred adjudication or higher, as a guilty finding. And we see that when you're prosecuted, there's a very high probability that you will be found um, uh, true or guilty. So white children, you're looking at 0.89 is the probability. For African American students, statistically they're the same as white in this category. Hispanic students are slightly higher with 1.3% more higher probability of that finding. For the first time, we see immigrant status leading to a higher likelihood of a negative outcome. Second generation immigrants are 0.9% more likely to be found guilty than a non-immigrant student. Consistent with everything we've found so far, those students who are disciplined are more likely to have a negative outcome. So if you have average discipline, you're 0.4% more likely to be found guilty. And for those who have high discipline, you're looking at 0.8% more likely to be found guilty. So looking at what we found and comparing to our original research questions, we see that the relationship between school discipline and juvenile justice outcome moves well beyond the initial referral stage and goes into each of the subsequent steps. Now, we were able to find fairly good news in that the minority children in most cases were not more likely to receive the negative outcome in the justice system. But because we already established that minority children had much higher levels of school discipline, this plays out as a mechanism for minority children to have more of these juvenile justice outcomes. And we find no support for the perception of immigrants as being criminals that has become a popular talking point, as in almost every case, immigrant children were less likely to be involved in school discipline and in the juvenile justice system overall. Thank you for your time, and I hope that you're able to utilize the findings here to improve policy in your community.